Thanks. So my name is Jenny Dale. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the head of research, outreach, and instruction in the libraries here at UNCG. I love having the opportunity every year to be a moderator at the Honors Symposium, and I'm super excited today to host folks from all over the state of North Carolina. I am going to go ahead and introduce our first presenter. The way that we have decided to run the show today is that our presenters will each present, and we will have a short Q&A after each one. And then depending on our time, we might have some time at the end for general questions as well. But we will be starting today with Brianna Wilson. And Brianna Wilson is a junior at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She is double majoring in psychology and social work. And she's a student in the University Honors Program. So Brianna, I will let you take it away.
Hi, thanks for that welcome. I'll just go ahead and share my screen with you guys. Let's see. Okay, can you guys see it's loading still, but can you see it?
I can tell that it's loading, so it is sharing. Something just happened. Yes, there we go. It's working really hard to get this presentation up. It must be really good. So.
There we go. Okay. All right, awesome. Sorry about that wait. So I am presenting on stereotypes and stigmas surrounding homelessness. So I thought I would start the presentation by setting the tone with this quote. So it says, after 1 month, fatigue overwhelmed me, my hygiene dipped, I walked everywhere, developing blisters on my feet, and they never got air because I slept with my socks and shoes on. I bathed on Thursdays and Sundays, either by swimming in the lake with a bar of soap or showering in the park locker rooms. All other days, I smelled repulsive. Sometimes people jumped up when I sat next to them on the bus or at the library, which both embarrassed and humored me. So I thought I would start with that quote. So kind of just to give a brief summary or description of stereotypes. So it basically springs from our human intersubjectivity, the fact that as members of society, we have a pretty good idea of what other members of our society think about lots of things, including the major groups and identities in society. So all that jumble, it basically just means that we tend to make assumptions about groups of people. It's just a natural thing that our society does. So I wanted to play a brief 1-minute video. This is just people that have experienced homelessness in their life and some of the stereotypes that they have been kind of people have used towards them or they've experienced.
They're dirty, they smell bad.
They don't want to get cleaned up.
They don't have a place to live because they spend all their money on drugs.
They make bad choices because of their addiction and they abandon their family and their friends.
They've had some tough breaks. Some of it's probably from bad decisions that were made. They want to be homeless.
They're not trustworthy.
Lazy.
They don't want to work. They're criminals.
If somebody tries to be nice, then they just get mad at them.
They're actually not homeless. It's just a way to con people
they don't care about themselves, so obviously they must not care about anybody else. Can we try that again?
Yeah, so that was just a brief video. To kind of talk about some of the stereotypes they experience. So to go over a few of the actual realistic causes of homelessness. So there are many causes. This is just a few of them, but there is like chances of domestic abuse, physical injuries, poor resources for veterans, addiction, mental illness, and unaffordable housing. And there's many more causes. But yeah, basically these are the stereotypes. The stereotypes that were mentioned in the other video are a lot of what they experience. And a common one is that all the people that are, experiencing homelessness abuse drugs, which is completely false. It's a harmful stereotype, and it leads to a lot of negative connotation to this community because of that. Okay, so kind of to talk about some of the barriers they experience. So a big one is employment. Many job applications require an address when applying. And so that can be a big barrier for people experiencing homelessness, and it can lead to them having to resort to panhandling, which to kind of just describe is when you see people on the street asking for money, just because they cannot gain employment without that address. And so kind of to talk about how stereotypes reinforce individualism. So individualism is basically the belief of the survival of fittest, the belief of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. America has a big individualism perspective. Basically, it's where we believe in helping ourselves. Like we believe in building ourselves up, but not necessarily helping each other. And so this individualistic concept leads to a lot of blame being put on like people that are homeless for their own situation, and it does not typically consider any external factors that could have led to it. And then this, concept also prevents people from further helping them, because then they tend to blame people that are in that situation. And so to also talk about barriers with homeless shelters. So a big barrier with that is that they don't receive enough funding. And typically, we have the rate of homelessness is constantly increasing, and there just aren't enough homeless shelters to accommodate that. And so that's another big issue as well. So to kind of dive deeper into homeless shelters, I wanted to touch on their hygiene, because that was something that was discussed in a lot of my research. And so a lot of it I found was there was limited shower time for people that were there. It was overcrowded, and that the cleanliness just wasn't up to par on what it should have been. And so that's a big issue in a lot of shelters. And then as well as funding again. So mainly the federal government provides grants, or they receive donations to these shelters. But again, it's just not enough to keep up with the need of shelters. And then I also want to really recommend this book called Homeless But Human: Life in a Shelter by Rich Hebron. That's basically where I got the quote from earlier on homelessness. And it's just basically it's about an individual that purposely experiences homelessness. They cut off everyone in their life to kind of experience what it's like. And so they talk a lot about what each experience in each shelter was like for them, and how complicated it can be to even stay at one. They talk a lot about the stereotypes they experience, and they also talk a lot about what other people that they have met that are in the same situation and what they've gone through as well. So I highly recommend it if you're interested in this research. And I just also want to talk about some statistics that I found. So approximately 17 people per 10,000 experience homelessness each day. Another one I found particularly interesting was that 40% of men who are homeless are US veterans. So I found that a lot in my research. Like I mentioned earlier, being a US veteran is like a high probability too with homelessness, because they don't get the services they need. And sometimes the injuries that they sustain, they can't afford the medications and like the hospitalization that they need. So that leads to them becoming homeless. And then another statistic is 42% of children who are homeless identify as LGBTQ+. So I thought that was also a really important factor to consider in this research. And so what can we do? Like we've talked about these stereotypes, but what can be done? The main thing is spreading awareness and educating yourself and others. Talk about, these stereotypes and educate yourself on what is actually going on in this community, and educate others. If you see that the stereotypes are spreading, let people know and educate them, because it's important to stop them so that people that are experiencing this can get the assistance that they need, and like we can help and do what we can. So another thing too is volunteering in your community. You know, there's always shelters or food pantries that are looking for volunteers, and it is always a great way to get involved in your community. So get involved today. There's always something you can do. And then also I just have my references that I used for my research, and that's it. Thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brianna. That's a really interesting research there. So we would love to open it up for questions for Brianna about her research. And you can feel free to, I mean, we're a very small group, so feel free to just unmute yourself. You can also put questions in the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable with.
Can you talk a little bit about like your experience about reading the book that you mentioned, and like how if you had any, you know, preconceived notions about homelessness, like how did that change your perspective and how did that make you feel when you were reading?
Oh, definitely. In my paper, I did mention a bit about I myself believed a lot of stereotypes before coming to college. I think it was just like the environment that you grow up in and like, you know, what you hear from people. And so I think it's very easy to believe like what, you know, people tell you about certain groups of people. And so I definitely believe that before getting into this research. And when after researching, it just inspired me to learn more because, you know, I didn't realize there were so many different causes to homelessness. And that's like what needs to be talked about because it's not. So I definitely think it was very eye-opening for me. And like reading the content that I did could be hard at times because there's so many different situations people go through that are just so heartbreaking. And it's like, and there's certain things too in like society or external factors that could have been improved, like social welfare and things that could have prevented it that just aren't where they need to be yet. Thank you for that question.
Do we have any other questions? So question in the chat, so I'll read this for the recording. I loved the call to action. As a social work major, is this a field you would like to work in post-graduation?
It's definitely one I'm considering. This topic is very like talked about in the social work major, just because we focus a lot on social welfare and how like that a lot of times that helps or leads to homelessness. And so it's definitely one that I'm considering. I'm considering a few different ones. There's like that one. I was also considering foster care. There's just so many areas that I would want to work in.
So I have a question from my librarian perspective, thinking about research. And I'm wondering, is it challenging to do research on people experiencing homelessness because of some of the same barriers that they face, for example, not having a permanent address that can be used, or not necessarily having a stable, you know, place to sleep, that kind of thing? I would imagine it might be hard to reach people experiencing homelessness to talk to them about their experiences. Did you find that to be true when you were reading about this?
Oh, definitely. I think a lot of the sources that I found were people that either put themselves into their community to find their perspective. It's having, I didn't find a lot of resources where someone that had experienced it decided to step up and write about it. It was more like the book that I read where he decided he wanted to experience it, like it was his choice to learn more. I read another topic, it's where I got some of the causes of homelessness from, where it was actually a person that frequently interacts with the homeless community, and they donate a lot of things to them, and they go to talk to them just to be like a friendly person and like, you know, just to talk to them about their life and how they're doing and bring them, you know, sometimes some like donations. And so they talked a lot about like what they saw, but it was still a perspective from someone that was talking to them rather than the actual person. But it was still really enlightening because they did feel comfortable around this person enough to share their story most of the time.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I could see that being a challenging balance to strike, both being sort of an outsider coming into the community and, you know, asking for this information or learning about experiences. Awesome, thank you. All right, any other questions for Brianna? This is always harder for me on Zoom because I'm like, what if someone's typing? Okay, well, I am going to go ahead and move on to the next one. Hopefully we will have a little bit of time at the end. If you do have a question for Brianna that you think of later, feel free to put it in the chat and I'll hold those until the end in case we end up having a little bit of time. But let's give Brianna a virtual round of applause. That was excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for answering our questions. All right. Look at all that applause. I love it. Okay, excellent. Thank you again, Brianna. So next we have Allison McCoy. Allison is in her second year at Durham Tech Community College studying English literature, and she's an aspiring writer and social commentator. So Allison, take it away.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I can. I think it's this one. Oops. Oops. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes, your volume is a little soft for me. I don't know if it is for other folks as well. Y'all can tell
Okay.
me in the chat.
If I talk louder, does that
That's
help?
perfect.
Okay.
That sounds great.
Great. Okay. Let me see if I can. Okay. All right. Yeah. So my name is Allison McCoy, and I will be presenting my honors project on the topic of class consciousness as it is seen in Catherine Mansfield's short story, The Garden Party. And I will be comparing it to critiques about class consciousness in the 21st century. So just a brief overview, I am first going to define class consciousness as it is seen today, as well as look at how social class and society were developing during the World War I era. We will also look at the literature during the era and give some background on Catherine Mansfield. Then we will look at the story and go more in depth at the social critiques presented in it. To begin with how we see social class today, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have bore witness to great shifts in the economy as there have been a lot of people who have lost their income due to the pandemic. There has been an extreme shift in the labor market and a severe shortage of workers. We have seen inflation rising rapidly in recent years. With the shift in the economy, we have also seen the middle class depleting, where our millionaires are becoming billionaires and buying super yachts and Twitter. And the people who are already considered lower class are slipping further into poverty. As the rich are getting richer, it's getting increasingly harder for people, primarily immigrants and people of color, to realize the American dream because small businesses can no longer compete with monopolies. We've also seen an increased divide in social class due to the expansion of the internet and social media, where there is increased pressure to display their lavish possessions and material wealth, where people are showing off their fancy cars and houses and vacations. And there's a lot of pressure to maintain this image, even if it may not be financially possible. So the rapidly shifting economy and social climate can be compared to the post-World War I era, where during the war, people had become exposed to socialism and communism and new technology, which led to a shift in the political landscape of Europe and the United States. So the literature during this time, which is now known as the modern era of literature, was very reflective of these changes and really focused on how people were emotionally affected by the changing world. And the literature was also very critical of the changing world and capitalist and class systems that were in place in society. One writer in particular who was making these critiques in her literature was Catherine Mansfield, who moved from New Zealand to London to attend Queen's College. So she received a very liberal education during this time. And she wrote a lot about social class and specifically the fantasy of equality between the working class and the upper class. And her social critiques come from the emphasis on the fact that this equality is purely fantasy. So the story The Garden Party was written in 1922, and it is about an upper class girl named Laura, and her family is throwing a fancy garden party for all of their friends. And they're setting up the party when they hear that a neighboring working class man was thrown off his horse that morning and died. And upon hearing this news, Laura becomes very upset and asks her family to cancel the party because she is worried about what the neighbors are going to think. And her family quickly shuts down the idea. They have the party, and Laura has a wonderful time and later brings some food to the widow. And she is overcome with emotion when she pays her respects to the dead man. And she goes home with all of these thoughts of life and what her status really means. So Mansfield explores the relationship between the upper class and lower class by contrasting them throughout the story. And in doing so, she raises the question of how much empathy from oppressors matters to those who are oppressed. So let's take a closer look at how she conveys this message in the story and what this means in the world today. So in the story, she's very demeaning of her main character, Laura, and she paints her as this naive little girl who doesn't know how to do anything for herself because she absolutely fumbles through the conversation that she has with the workers who are setting up the party in the beginning of the story. And we see this today where there's a stark difference in responsibility levels between rich and poor people, where someone who grew up with a cook and a maid and a nanny lived a very different life than someone who grew up with a single mother and 3 siblings in a 1-bedroom apartment. The issue with this is that those who are in the upper class do not know how to interact and relate to those with different backgrounds, which leads to increased social divide as well as underdeveloped social skills. So in this story, we also see Mansfield include a lot of symbols of status and compare Laura's status to the widow and her family. She also includes symbols of empathy, like Laura wanting to cancel the party and the gift basket of food that Laura brings. But these symbols are examples of performative activism. So performative activism is an action done to ease the guilt of the oppressor rather than to uplift the oppressed. So today, an example of this would be a company selling rainbow merchandise during June, which is LGBTQ Pride Month. They're selling it to make a profit and to protect their image by quote unquote proving they're supportive, while they're not actually doing anything meaningful for the queer community. So in the story, the gift basket was a suggestion from Laura's mother, and it is more to appease Laura's emotions than to actually use their wealth to provide aid to the widow and her family. There's also a large contrast between the dialogue between Laura and her family and Laura and the widow and her family. Laura exists in an echo chamber, which means that she only really interacts with her friends and family who share her status and her family's beliefs. This is made clear through the dichotomy of her actions around her family versus with the widow's family. Her siblings have also learned from their parents, which is why Laura gets so much immediate pushback from her family when she suggests canceling the party. Existing in an echo chamber isn't inherently a bad thing, as it's good to interact with people who you can relate to. But what it does is it creates a very narrow worldview and further enforces the boundaries of social class. In the story, when Laura steps outside of her bubble, she is noticeably uncomfortable with the shift in her environment, similar to what I said earlier about the upper class's inability to interact with those outside their spheres. So when she goes home after visiting the widow and her family, she has experienced a shift in her worldview, but she's unable to articulate her feelings. And the last line of the story is when Laura is talking to her brother and she says, isn't life, and she just can't really get the words out. And he says, isn't it, darling? And that's how the story ends. So it's unclear whether Laura really did gain any sort of class consciousness from her experience, or if her family quickly tamped down any empathy that may have arisen in her. But the message in the story is clear that interacting with those and being able to sympathize with people who come from different social classes creates a more equal and loving society. So this glimpse at the end of the story goes back to Mansfield's popular structure of including a fantasy of equality. So in this case, the critique that she presents is about how empathetic emotions interact between those of different social classes, which Mansfield witnessed back in the 1920s and what we're witnessing in the 2020s today. In conclusion, class consciousness and empathy are important in order to bring out real and not just performative social change and to make a more inclusive society, which is something that Mansfield really wanted and something that we all want in the world today as well. Does anyone have any questions?
All right, thank you so much, Allison. Round of applause, virtual applause for Allison. All right, excellent. So again, like we did before, please feel free to unmute yourself to ask your question. You can put questions in chat, whatever makes the most sense to you, but we do have time for questions.
I just want to say I love the comparison with the garden party and like the modern class system. I guess my question is, was it difficult to dive that deep into that story? Because I feel like it could be so difficult sometimes to pick out symbolism like that and like all the different topics you talked about.
Yeah, it was definitely difficult at first. I feel like I really started to get into doing more of like a deep dive after actually reading more background about the author herself, because there's a lot of parallels in all of her stories. So when I was, reading her other works and reading more about her and her particular writing style, then I kind of went back to the garden party and I was like, oh, she's doing that thing here that she does in her other stuff. So it's kind of one of the stories that you kind of have to read it multiple times and get a little background. There's a question in the chat that says, what do you think Laura describes life as when she says isn't life? That is a tough question. And I actually talked, my professor who I did this project with for her class, we talked a lot about the last line. I personally think that Laura is not so much like really coming to terms with her status, but I feel like it's more about, to her, kind of the fragility of life, and like she sees, like she has this great garden party and she has this big house and rich family, and she doesn't ever want that to go away. So I think going to the widow's house and seeing like, oh, these people have nothing, it kind of like scared her, and kind of like she's like, oh my God, like thank God our life isn't like that, but like isn't life just crazy and fragile? So I think that's kind of what she's talking about when she says that.
Do we have any other questions for Allison? Well, I have one, so I'll ask mine. Have you read a lot of literature? This is kind of one of those. I majored in English, and I'm the librarian for English here at UNCG. But this is one of those eras that I have not read a lot from, and I'm wondering, have you read other authors from the modern era or other modernists, and are they doing the same kind of thing as Mansfield is?
I think I haven't read a ton of like specifically British literature from that era, but I think that there's definitely a difference between British literature from that era and American literature from that era, because World War I had such a different impact between the two countries. So I think a lot of the modern era of American literature is very much like, oh, the Roaring 20s, but it also has kind of this like melancholic tone to it. Whereas the British literature, like stuff like Mansfield was writing, it's a little bit more like, it's a little bit sharper and it's a little bit more poignant, I guess, about like the actual problems that was going on during that era and like during World War I and everything, whereas the American literature is a lot more metaphoric.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like there was a big immediacy in Britain being so close to where a lot of like fighting was happening. So that's really interesting. Yeah. All right, thank you. Any other questions for Allison? As with Brianna, if you do think of questions later, please feel free to put those in the chat and we will come back to them at the end if we have time. And if there aren't any questions right now, we'll do another virtual round of applause for Allison. Thank you so much, Allison, for sharing your work with us. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
And I will go ahead and introduce our third speaker, Anusha, sorry. Anusha Ahmad is a biology undergraduate from William Peace University. She graduated with honors and was part of the honors committee for all of her time at the university. She's served various roles, from being a peer mentor to first-year students, as well as being the chair of diversity and awareness at WPU. So Anusha, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Jenny. I will first go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so if my screen is visible to everybody,
It looks good.
Okay. So in my research paper, I analyzed who is an American and the melting pot narrative analysis by using different sources such as journal articles and literary reviews. Being an American must be more than just paying taxes, having the right to vote, and embracing the American way of life. The thesis of my paper revolves around that all of us are a part of this huge mix of people that create America. We do not have to lose our individual identities, unlike that mentioned in the melting pot analogy. We all can be different and identify as one nation. Let's talk a little bit about who is classified as an American. So according to most internet portals, citizens and nationals of the United States of America are considered as an American. What does being an American mean to most of us? The right to freedom of speech, embracing diversity, embracing the American way of life, having equal rights in determining the country's leadership. Well, America is currently home to more than 333 million people, according to the Worldometer, and all these people are not native to the land itself. To be an American goes beyond the legal definition of being an American citizen. According to Philip Gleason, a renowned historian, a person who did not have to be of any particular ethnic background, religion, language, or nationality in order to be an American. All one had to do was live by the political ideology pegged on abstract ideals of republicanism, equality, and liberty, paying taxes, voting in elections, and serving the country at home or abroad is what being an American means based on a universalist ideological character. So the American dream is something that every immigrant brought to this country. This was said by, this is a quote that I've shared by the retired US Army General Colin Powell. He said that the American dream is something that every immigrant brought to this country, as my parents did, and that is the ability to go as far as you can in life, limited only by your own dreams and willingness to work hard. And above all, the American dream is for these folks meant that your children will have the opportunity to do better than you. Now, through a different lens, many people look at America as the land for white people and white culture only. So where do we see prominent examples of whitewashing in today's times? One needs to look no further than the movie Doctor Strange. In this movie, the British actress Tilda Swinton was of Celtic heritage, and she was cast to play the ancient role of an immortal Tibetan sorcerer. And Unsurprisingly, this was followed by many questions to the casting directors, and Marvel's response were quite complicated, citing that they were at a risk of losing a large audience from Tibet, and which is why they were putting profit ahead of ethics. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Another example that we have seen in today's times is most A-list celebrities like Will Smith and Denzel Washington are frequently cast because of their talent and popularity as characters who were originally intended to be white. In a Marvel Cinematic Universe, Samuel Jackson is iconic in his portrayal of Nick Fury, who is in the original comics a white guy. Also in the Marvel franchise is Elba, who plays the Norse god Hemidel. These, however, are few and far between and virtually never happen to lesser known actors. With all the evidence there is supporting it is impossible to deny that whitewashing exists. So now looking at the Great Melting Pot, or as some people call it, the Great American Potluck. The melting pot is a monoculture metaphor for a heterogeneous society becoming more homogeneous. The different elements melting together with a common culture, an alternative being a homogeneous society becoming more heterogeneous through the influx of foreign elements with different cultural backgrounds possessing the potential to create disharmony within the previous culture. It can also create a harmonized, hybridized society known as cultural amalgamation.
For those of you who might be watching the recording, we had some sort of technical glitch, but here we are. We're back again with Anushay Ahmad. Anushay, take it away.
Thank you. And so I guess where I left off was talking about the Great Melting Pot or the Great American Potluck. So the melting pot is a monocultural metaphor for a heterogeneous society becoming more homogeneous, and the different elements melting together with a common culture is an alternative being a homogeneous society becoming more heterogeneous through the influx of foreign elements with different cultural backgrounds possessing the potential to create disharmony within the previous culture. It can also create a harmonious, hybridized society known as cultural amalgamation. Historically, it is often used to describe cultural integration of immigrants into the United States. A related concept has been defined as cultural additivity, and the melting together metaphor was used in the 1780s. The exact term melting pot came into general use in the US after it was used as a metaphor describing a fusion of nationalities, cultures, and ethnicities into the 1900s. Now looking at immigration. Immigration creates diversity, which is the quality of being different. And different definitely does not mean bad, but many Americans do not, or at some point in life did not feel that way. Early immigrants into the United States were met with harsh tension, a fight between the old and the new and the white. Americans expected all of the immigrants to jump into the melting pot and come out American. What many were unwilling to understand was that no two cultures are alike, and we will never be equal in any intercultural encounter. These differences in cultures in the US have created ethnocentrism, in which cultures think that theirs is superior to the next. Whenever you feel this way and you interact with someone of another culture, you create a false identity for them. And everyone has a unique identity, and it is hard to fully portray when someone has already prejudged you. Then it is also harder to communicate with them. Rather than communicating as two people, power is brought into the conversation, and that leads us to understanding that it is more important to be self-reflective and know your culture as well as the other cultures. The melting pot comes off as nothing more than a false fallacy, and rather than creating one culture, we should try to welcome and understand all cultures that create the American society. As Barack Obama said, we were strangers once too, and whether our forebears were strangers who crossed the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Rio Grande, we are here only because this country welcomed them in and taught them that to be an American is about something more than what we look like or what our last names are or how we worship. Thank you for your time and attention. Are there any questions? I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Anusha. And again, so sorry for that interruption, but let's give you a round of applause. All right. Yeah, any questions for Anusha?
For my question, I guess I would say like, I loved your presentation. I definitely know it's a bit of a controversial topic. So I just wondered, did you have issues with running into some biased resources when you were trying to find out more information?
So while I was doing my research for this paper, I definitely saw the both sides of the coin, right? And then there were some articles or some journals which were sort of in the middle. They'd give you a sense of both sides, but leave it up to you to decide what you think is the melting pot or how accurate is it. For me, this process was something that I personally came up to this conclusion where I said that, yes, I agree more with the side that says that we need to stop analyzing everybody with this metaphor and putting it in this, box basically of an analogy that the melting pot is referring to, which is why I feel like my work eventually got more into the side that is against the melting pot analogy and does not believe that it is 100% accurate. However, I do believe that there are some parts to it which are not 100% incorrect either. But more to answer your question, that yes, I did see a lot of biased articles and articles with completely favoring or being against the idea. However, I decided to focus more on what started feeling right to me, if that makes more sense, while doing my research, because it became more of a personal project as well, as we had not just done one paper for this, but it was in our honors class. And because my professor is here too, so I'm sure she'd remember, we started it off with a mini project, and then we got ourselves into thinking about the work that we're doing. So I invested my own ideas into it as well, but definitely based off of all the research that is present there. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. I have a question actually thinking about your and Brianna's presentations kind of in conversation. One of the things that Brianna talked about was that sort of American individualism narrative. And I'm wondering, is that, and the whole sort of bootstraps, like it's a meritocracy and we all have the same, et cetera. Is that at odds with the melting pot metaphor, do you think, or is it part of it?
So I think I would say that it is somewhat part of it, because what it's trying to say is that, yes, we're all individuals, but then we're all the same kind of individuals to present ourselves as one, So the idea of getting into the pod and coming out as one, you're still going to be an individual person, but you will be the same of many kinds of you all around you, basically, if that makes sense. That is what I get out of it. And so I do feel that it is definitely sort of a part of it. if you look at it from one perspective. But from another perspective, I could say that it's completely against what the melting pot analogy is suggesting, because it does not want individual identities to shine out more than it does, uniting everybody in the similar fashion.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I was just thinking about while you were presenting, I was like, oh, I see some connections here. Any other questions for Anusha? It's so nice that your professor is here supporting you. Thank you for joining us. It's lovely.
My questions were already answered, so I don't have any more questions.
I bet yours were. I bet you've had question time.
But I do think it's interesting to see how there were kind of relationships between all three of the presentations. Really, you can see some of the same themes coming out from the second presentation as well. So.
Anusha, I have a quick question for you. You spoke about this paper, and then I know that you work in DEI as well. And you mentioned power. So how has this idea of the melting pot folded into your work with DEI and the power implications of the melting pot? Has it inspired you to work in different ways to break down the melting pot idea? I'm just curious.
Oh, hi, Dr. Gaylor. It's nice to hear from you. I would say that yes, it has definitely inspired me to work in a better way than I might have been working in, or my perspective has definitely strengthened, if that makes sense, more so with such research that I have read about during my time for this paper. I say this because when you see that how power influences the majority, then there's no denying that there's definitely more pros than cons to being in a powerful position. So if you can be a powerful person in any society, for that matter, in today's times, and you can influence people in the right manner, then I feel like you're doing at least some bit of good in the world today. Which is why within diversity, inclusion, and just awareness in general about different cultures around us and how we should be respectful of one another, but being respectful does not mean that you have to accept what the other person is saying or completely disagree with it, but you can always be in the middle, in the center, where you do what feels right to you, but you don't look down upon anybody else because their right is 100% to them, and it might not be 100% to you, and it doesn't have to be. So just trying to let the world sort of grasp this idea in a better manner. That is what I try in everywhere that I am, or every communication that I have with anybody on a day-to-day basis. That is what I try more and more every day, especially more since I've done such kind of work. I feel like it has given me a wider understanding of what's being said all over the world, and what are people writing, how are they going about trying to test different analogies, such as the melting pot, how this was, there were quite a few ways that research for this just testing out the melting pot analogy was also done. Some simple ones were just asking people what it means to be an American. Some people answered that with saying what their nationality is and saying, this is what, because this is my nationality, so I'm an American. To some, it meant, oh, I have the freedom of speech and I have the right to vote, so that is what being an American means to me. So also looking into that kind of work and trying to understand that not everybody is always going to give you the same viewpoint as you already have, and also there's always going to be room for you to expand the viewpoint that you currently hold. So I feel like such things can be done in an even better manner when you are in a position of power where people are going to listen to you more, going to not even listen, but just see you more often than they'd see anybody else who's not in